Ocean Quigley. Welcome to the Game Informer Show, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, man. It's a real honor. I feel like on this podcast, we've had a lot of developers as guests on, and we've tried to corner a lot of the market, but we have not really touched on Maxis yet.
Cool.
And you are an ideal person to talk about Maxis and their role in the industry. So thanks for joining us,
I was there for almost 20 years or so. Yeah, in the ballpark of 20 years.
Wow. How many other people were there for that long?
Not too many. Actually, I outlasted Will Wright himself.
My God, no one outlasts Wright. Well, let's cover a little bit of your history later on, but for now, I'm curious as what your life is like. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see his wonderful art studio in the background. But I'm curious, just walk us through your day, man. What are you up to these days?
So I've got a new project I'm working on with some dudes from Maxis and elsewhere. So I spend a chunk of the day just doing 3D modeling and doing design and writing code. And then this is a painting studio with lots of paintings of naked people around, and so I have models come out here and paint for a chunk of the day as well. So it's pretty evenly split between fine art, painting stuff, and game dev stuff.
And which one's the moneymaker and which one's the passion project?
Oh, they both they both do okay. I have a gallery in San Francisco that shows my paintings, and they sell. And the new game, Atomic Space Command, is still in development, so we're not making any money from it right now. We're basically just developing it, and it'll be a while before it actually pays any bills. So it's not as uneven a split as you might imagine.
Okay. So I saw right when you left Maxis, you're starting to work on an iOS project, Jelly Grade?
Yeah. So we a couple guys and I did a sort of some experiments in fluid simulation games, fluid simulation and life simulation stuff. We did that for maybe 9 months or so, and there was sort of creative differences among the two engineers that I was working with, and so that fell apart. And so then I went and did a bunch of consulting stuff with Maxis again, and then left back in September to do this new game, Atomic Space Command.
And so what's the pitch for Atomic Space Command? What's going on here?
Oh, that's pretty straightforward. That's a game where you and your buddies construct a ship together collaboratively. So it's like a build out that you do with other people online, or by yourself if you want to, and then you fly it into combat as a crew. So you and the other people on your ship are a team, duking it out in an arena, or fighting against the AI, or fighting against other players, either in like full co-op mode where you're on your ship and your friends are on your ship and there's other ships that have people on them, or you're duking it out against red team versus blue team stuff. So you might have a bunch of ships with people on red team and a bunch of ships with people on blue team, and that mixes maybe some Artemis Bridge stuff and some FTL stuff and some Sim stuff, but it's more arcadey than any of those. You're kind of flying around and dodging and shooting stuff and laying mines, and there's a kind of a base construction aspect as well.
Yeah, I saw you're kind of terraforming planets or just building bases on planets.
It's more like you're building bases on them. So you basically fly around, you claim we've got a little dynamic solar system, a solar system model. So the sun's in the middle and all the planets are in orbit and there's moons, and you're basically flying around the solar system and grabbing planets, putting down essentially bases on them, like domes and resource extractors and turrets and reactors to power the whole thing. And the game's kind of a capture the flag sort of game. In the solar system, you're trying to grab planets from the other team. The other team is trying to grab planets from you, and you're building on those planets to get the war materials to carry out the effort. But it's got some simulation aspects to it. There's like little base simulation, and there's a ship simulation going on as well.
Nice.
So that's what we're working on.
So what's it like to work on a small team again?
You kind of get in a big team. You have a lot of bureaucracy, but you also have a lot of amplification. Like you come up with a design, and you can throw a dozen artists at it, and there's a whole infrastructure in place for doing things at scale, which is kind of exciting as a creator, because you can see the things that you do really take shape quickly. When you're part of a really small team. There's like 4 or 5 of us on this project. Man, you're doing it all. Like I'm writing shaders and I'm doing 3D modeling and I'm doing design. And if I'm not doing any 3D modeling, nobody's doing any 3D modeling. So the whole thing is a much more kind of hands-on. I mean, you have all the control, which is the nice side, and you're not answerable to any producers or anybody who's holding the purse strings. But you also have no amplification. Whatever you do is what you're going to do.
Is it invigorating or just a pain in the ass to have that much control again?
Oh, it's both. I mean, there's times when you really want to just be able to scale, just have people that you can say, okay, here's the design for a bunch of chassis for ships. I'd like to have just all these built. Here's designs for a whole bunch of different life support systems and a whole bunch of different blasters. Let's just build all these. And so that's something that I miss. But on the other side, you get to make it exactly what you want to make it like. So there's a lot of artistic control that comes with that.
Do you feel more control and there's more self-expression going on in Atomic Space Command than most or all of the projects at Maxis?
I was lucky at Maxis on games like Spore and SimCity and The Sims. I had a lot of creative authorship. So I think those were unusually good situations for a sort of a creative designer to participate in. So not necessarily. The large scale vision of those games was obviously way more collaborative than just sort of me and another guy trying to figure out what we're doing. But in the domain of the stuff that we're working on, for SimCity, the buildings looked pretty much like I wanted them to look, or in Spore, the sort of the creature parts and the creature designs were kind of what I wanted them to be. So I can't really complain about not having creative authorship in those, because it was a pretty good deal.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I'm glad you guys are hitting what seems like a good market for Steam, which is kind of nitty gritty space, ship design, combat stuff. But did you ever consider, because it must have crossed your mind, doing something that was a Kickstarter, something in the vein of The Sims? I mean, you have such an amazing pedigree, and to not rally up support from that is interesting.
Yeah, it seemed like it was better to try and do something new, not just sort of ride on the pedigree of previous accomplishments.
That makes you very unique in the game industry.
Yeah. Well, it's I mean, you only have one go around, right? So you might as well try and do exciting new things every time you have a chance. And I don't think I know I was just not that excited about trying to do a clone of SimCity or The Sims. I wanted to sort of make something new, take a whole bunch of new ingredients and combine them in a new way. Which isn't to say I'll never. Sort of building model worlds is really exciting stuff for me. I really like it a lot. So that's stuff that I might get back into at some point. But for now, it's toy solar systems and ship battles in those solar systems.
That's nice. You're an artist, Ocean. This is what you do, is you make new stuff.
Exactly.
Do you want to just go back in time and talk about what it was like when you first walked into Maxis, what year it was, what the studio vibe was like?
Sure. I joined Maxis in '95, and so SimCity 2000 had shipped. And in fact, I got to know Will and the people working at Maxis because I was working for Pruma Publishing, which was the company that did hint guide books back in the '90s. Mm-hmm. And so I did I worked on the hint guide book for SimCity 2000, and I really got into SimCity 2000 a lot. I played a lot of SimCity 2000, and I realized after a while that there was a whole new really cool thing that these guys were doing, and that it would be much more fun to actually work on making those things than it would be to sort of write hint guides about them and make hint books about them.
That's a fascinating place to start, because then you just know their design philosophy inside and out, because you have to break it all down.
I mean, you really have to understand it pretty well to write the books on it. So I started there, and they put me to work on. I'd been doing 3D stuff, and back in the 90s, this is going to make me sound like a really old person. Back in the 90s, that was kind of exotic. People were using deep paint to do most of the art. It was still largely sprite-based game world, and I'd always been kind of a techie sort of artist, and so I'd gotten my hands on really early 3D programs like Sculpt 3D and Swivel 3D and 3D Studio Release 2 and Release 3. And so I built up a portfolio of really interesting now be laughable. But for the time, it was really impressive 3D stuff, and I was able to take it to Maxis and say, hey, you guys are eventually going to want to move to 3D, and I already know how to do all this stuff. So they gave me a job, like pretty much as a 24-year-old. I mean, it was kind of a kid, and did work on a lot of games that you've never heard of. Worked on this game called Full Tilt Pinball, which Maxis published, that we did, like it was in Windows 95 default for a while.
Okay. Wait, is that the space-themed one?
Yeah, there was a space game one.
Okay, totally got it. Yep.
Yeah, it's a long time ago. And then Will had me, I worked on the Sega Saturn port of SimCity 2000, and then new games like Streets of SimCity and SimCopter. And so at the time, everybody was still kind of buzzed off of the success of SimCity 2000, and we're trying to figure out all the other things that you could do with it. And then I worked on SimCity 3000, which was going to be the major kind of reboot of SimCity after SimCity 2000, but that project was really confused. People wanted to make it a fully sort of 3D world that you could explore at ground level, but this was before 3D cards were a thing, and the machines were nowhere near capable of doing that. It was a decade or maybe even 20 years ahead of its time to do it the fidelity that we wanted to do.
But what about like a SimCopter then? I mean, you could get on the ground and explore that in a 3D environment.
Yes, but SimCopter wasn't really a city simulation. In SimCopter you took your city that you'd built out of that you'd built by playing SimCity 2000, and you flew around in it as a static environment. So we put pedestrians and cars and stuff like that. SimCopter is famous, of course, for the Easter egg. I don't know if you know about
I wanted to hear that story. Yeah, can you please tell our listeners what this Easter egg is all about?
Right. So we had a programmer, Jacques, who actually has since gone on to be pretty famous. He started a group called the Yes Men, but that's a different story. Okay. So he was a programmer, and he thought it would be pretty funny if on his birthday, when you successfully landed your helicopter after having done all these missions, there's a brass band, a police brass band that welcomes you, and the mayor gives you a speech and stuff like that, and it was kind of like the big victory celebration. So he thought that on his birthday there'd be a slim chance that instead of seeing kind of like the brass band dressed all in their police blues, they'd all kind of just be sort of Chippendale dancers with flashing nipples.
It's basically just like Party Boy from Jackass, just like filling this crude 3D city with party boys.
And man, the graphics were, it was really crude. The people looked like they were made of pipe cleaners. I'm not, I don't want to give you the impression that this is all photorealistic. So yeah, you had kind of a party boy scene when you landed, and the mayor was sort of there with his flashing nipples, So, but Jacques wasn't a great programmer, so his random number generator, instead of basically making this show up once every 10,000 hours of play, would make it show up every 8 hours of play, something like that.
Well, I'm glad that it's so well known for this bizarre Easter egg and whatnot. But I loved SimCopter back in the day. Do you think it gets enough credit as being, I don't know, would you consider it a pioneer in kind of the open world genre?
It was a first experiment in that. Calling it a pioneer maybe overstates it, but it was a stab in that direction. We wanted to make a world like this sort of SimCity scale world that you could fly around and do stuff in. And the computers at the time were not really, it was a stretch. Like this was after we released SimCopter, the first generation of 3D cards came out, and they were still pretty terrible, but they blew our minds with how much better they were than with just doing everything in software, doing straight up software rendering. And so that was like, wow, you could actually make these textures smoothed and not crawly and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's so fun because I have such great memories of that game, and of course just trying to get like the attack helicopter and all that stuff. And then I go back and look at it. That protagonist is one of the most charmingly janky things I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you were on the art team, right? Did you guys have like amazing concept art of what this guy looked like, and then in game it just becomes this blobby blur mess?
Well, actually, one thing that's kind of interesting there is that that the system that Will came up with, along with Jacques, for doing the people, which, and the people were kind of just balls and pipe cleaners. I mean, they look terribly crude and simple, but that system actually gave rise to The Sims. So a bunch of the stuff that Will and Jacques figured out about, like, hey, here's little people, and we'll think about how they're going to move around and stuff like that. That was sort of Will's first stab or first experiment at The Sims as a like something that you'd play with. So there were later experiments, and none of that code from SimCopter probably made it into The Sims. But that was the sort of the first turn of the crank with having people be something that you'd simulate and play with. And SimCopter was just the first place that Will thought, well, we'll toss them in there and see how they work.
God, I just remember picking up so many people in SimCopter and then having the back of my helicopter filled with all those heart beeps. And I remember even like picking up dogs, and then they'd show up as people when they're in the helicopter. It was such a bizarre game.
I mean, keep in mind, those games like those there was like probably like 5 of us that worked on it. Game teams were tiny back in that day.
Atomic Space Command size.
Yeah, exactly. Like the size of small little groups.
God, what was the most challenging part about developing it?
All the 3D stuff had to be handwritten, right? I mean, this is sort of before you had 3D engines that you could buy off the shelf that have hardware acceleration, that have sort of texture pipelines and all that. So it all had to be hand rolled. Like, that's one of the things that's kind of interesting comparing it to Atomic Space Command and modern projects. Like, now it's so easy. You just get Unity or get Unreal, and it's off the shelf, and it all kind of works. And the 3D modeling tools are really sophisticated, and you got plenty of artists that know how to use them. And so it's pretty straightforward to slam together something that's impressive. But back in the day with SimCopter and Streets of SimCity, which was another one that was kind of in that using that same engine.
Also love it.
Man, we just had to do it all from scratch. Everything had to be written in pretty low-level code. You had to shave every polygon off. I mean, we wound up making those helicopters out of, they're 200 polygon helicopters. So everything has this sort of folded origami quality to it. So trying to get anything that was not, just awful in those poly counts with performance was really hard. We could live in a golden age now by comparison, looking back at it. Of course, it was all super exciting at the time because it wasn't sprites. It was like, this was fully 3D. Look, you can change the camera. And that was a big deal.
Are you nostalgic about those days? Do you ever go back and try and play the game on an old computer or boot up YouTube videos or anything?
I do every now and then, and I'm kind of appalled with how terrible they look. Because in my memory, they kind of look like they were sort of exciting and novel, and they have a lot of the wonder of that early experimental day. But now you compare it to any modern game that looks stunning, and man, it looks like it was whittled out of wood.
Out of crude polygons. I mean, it is really impressive. I remember it blowing my mind back in the day, thinking that you could import your cities from SimCity 2000 into Streets of SimCity and SimCopter, because I remember my friends had SimCity 2000, and then we'd share these copies and try and like interconnect those worlds. It was mind blowing.
Yeah, that was pretty magical. Like that was something people had wanted to do from SimCity 2000 on. Like you make your city, and now you want to see what it's like to be down in the city, to get down, at street level and look around and see the life of the city. So yeah, Streets of SimCity and SimCopter were the first ones to try and give you some approximation of that. The worlds just weren't alive enough or robust enough or rich enough down at ground level to really pay off on that. So it was good as long for SimCopter, for example. It was good as long as you were sort of flying around at skyscraper level. But as soon as you got down to ground level, not so much.
Don't look, the horror. Look away, Marion. Well, let's focus on ground level then stuff with Sims. That's coming up a couple years later. I mean, we've heard the stories and the legends about how that game started. Did it feel monumental during development? Did you feel like this was something new?
Oh, no, it felt like it was another one of... I mean, the weird thing about working with Will Wright is that you never know... I mean, all of his ideas sound terrible, and you never know, like, if they're terrible brilliant or if they're terrible. Like, The Sims was one of those ones that was like, this was just really stupid. Like, the game was just not like, who wants to play this? And it was really nothing for a long time. And then all of a sudden, it flipped and it became magical. And it was I have to give Will a lot of credit for that, because he was pretty much pushing the thing himself in the face of a lot of skepticism from kind of the larger Maxis studio and from other people on the team. And it wasn't until he'd pushed it pretty far that that people went, oh, and even then we brought it to E3, and we didn't have a big booth. I mean, we were sort of nestled into the larger EA booth with a handful of monitors. Like, it was not a big, it wasn't a big splash, and it kind of stole the show, even though the signs were small and there were just a handful of monitors, but it was just this weird, fresh thing that came in.
Was it?
But no, it was not obvious that it was going to be. We thought that it would sell a few 100,000 copies and people would dig it, and it would be another interesting little Will project. The fact that it kind of ate the world was a surprise to us.
How much of that do you think was it expanding so well into a wider audience? Like, I think a majority of Sims fans that I know are women. Was that something?
In retrospect, yeah, but it had to initially appeal to your kind of core game market. Like, when the game first came out, if core gamers didn't find a game there, then they would never tell their girlfriends, or their little sisters would never find it. So, like, at the time, you couldn't just reach that market directly. You had to actually have a game that had some strategy and had some hardcore game mechanics against it, so that so the guys would play it. They'd play it for a week or two. They get kind of bored with it, and then their little sister would pick it up, or their girlfriend would pick it up. But yeah, no question. In retrospect, it was appealing to people who would never really play games otherwise.
Was it when it clicked over into everybody agreeing like this is working well? Was it when things were a little bit more gamified, to use that dumb term?
It was a bunch of things. The environments got richer. There was game progression, and you kind of knew what you wanted to do at the next stage. You as a player said, well, I want to try and get this couch, or I want to try and get a promotion. So there were game things to do. Enough of the sort of the simulation came into place that you could start projecting all the inner life of the Sims and the emotional relationships between the Sims. And then there was stuff the stuff that I worked on was mostly like the build mode and the neighborhood stuff. So I can't actually take any credit at all for the core of the Sims. The stuff that I worked on was like, okay, let's figure out how we're going to make walls and porches and roofs. And how the neighborhood is all going to work as a place.
Please tell me when you were developing that and coding it that you at least had the peaceful piano soundtrack that was eventually in the game
yes.
to help you be motivated going through it.
Yeah, the audio design for Maxis games was pretty consistent for a long time. Like, there was a kind of a Maxis style. Like for SimCity 4, we went with kind of a lot of the sort of Gershwin kind of 1940s, 1950s American music sounds, and it wasn't at all your kind of 8 Mile soundtrack. It was a much more kind of, oh, this is nice, I want to be here kind of thing.
Oh, it's amazing. Like, I ran into Chris Tilton at E3 last year, and he was the composer for SimCity 2013,
Right.
which was by a mile my favorite soundtrack from that year.
Yeah, it was a really good soundtrack, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing. And he was talking about how he had so much feedback from other programmers saying that when they were programming other game developers, they would always listen to SimCity 2013 soundtrack because it has like this inspirational driving tone that's so rare.
Something kind of interesting about SimCity 2013 where the simulation actually had was on a clock. So we had a frequency that the simulation ticked forward at. And I forget what it was, but just for the sake of argument, let's say that it was 4 times per second, for example.
Okay.
And so I realized that there's this kind of like a beat to the whole city. The simulation is going to tick at this frequency. That means that like lights are going to turn off and on at that frequency. That means like the street lights are going to turn at that frequency. It means that like basically the whole world operates at that tick, tick, tick. And so I asked Chris to put music onto that beat, so that basically there'd be this sort of drive of the music that would line up with the drive of the simulation. So if you look at it, I even made it so that the little Sims, the walking footprints of the Sims are on the beat. So there's this whole consistent drive to the city. And our music designer, we had our lead audio designer for SimCity is a guy named Kent Jolly. he was like, I have to fade this beat back at times, or we'll drive people mad. It'll just be so obnoxious. And I'm like, no, it must be on all the time.
It must be one big music video.
I even made it so that the like the poofs of smoke coming out of smokestacks were on the beat. But then Kent actually succeeded in like, okay, there's just gonna be times when the beat goes away and there's just gonna be washes of sound.
It can't be Steamboat Willie for 100 hours.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have some sympathy for that.
Sure.
I thought it was neat to keep it all metronomic, but
So
whatever.
Jumping back to Sims working on the neighborhood stuff, how influential were you in designing Mortimer Goth and that weirdo's house?
Not at all. Like I just did the systems,
Okay.
So I worked out like, okay, here's how floors work, or here's how swimming pools work, and these are sort of tile sets, and these are the draw operations, and here's how you snapshot the lot and embed it into a larger landscape and stuff like that. So I was kind of a art systems guy, and the sort of the character design, the character activity, the sort of the narrative life of The Sims, that was all like Chris Trottier and Connor Ryan. I mean, there were a whole bunch of designers that were sort of engaged with that and that did all that work. So yeah, that wasn't I can't take any credit for that.
Gotcha. And this is a weird running theme, but I'm piecing it all together now between your artwork and then Simcopter. But with The Sims, maybe it's just because I was 12 years old when it came out, but how much were you guys fascinated by the obsession on the internet with nude codes for The Sims? I take it you must have talked about it a lot, right?
So it was one of those things that you just sort of like, I'd say I was more surprised by when we did Spore, and we thought, well, you could make some jiggly stuff in Spore, sure, if you want to, but that's no big deal. And then it turned out to be the thing, the thing that everybody remembers about Spore was all the crazy penis monsters, and so the nude codes on The Sims were like, oh yeah, whatever, but people are people. That's kind of stuff that they're going to look for. But man, I was blown away by the repulsive creativity of our fan base when it came to Spore. Like the first week that it came out, we all just sort of watched the new creatures people were making come in, because we had like the network side of it. So hit refresh and there'd be another 1,000 creatures, on the in the encyclopedia, and we're like, oh my God, can you believe this? And of course we officially as EA we had to frown on it and delete them and stuff like that. But as developers, we were like, you guys are awesome. Oh my God.
Just porn planets. Welcome to Sex World.
Exactly. And, we did all this procedural animation stuff for Spore too. So, the little creatures would dance around, and we had all the soft body dynamics. And soft body dynamics, we thought, it'll make tails wiggle and stuff like that. And it did make tails wiggle.
Indeed it did. Jesus Christ. Well, not to keep on this pervy theme, but let's keep it rolling. How involved were you guys with Sims Online and what that eventually became?
So again, for me, I was just doing the kind of the art system mechanics. How you piece together buildings into larger environments. I helped Will out with some of the social graph stuff. Like we did a bunch of visualizations for social graph stuff. But by and large, on the art side and on the art system side, Sims Online just borrowed stuff that we'd already figured out from The Sims. So there wasn't that much for me to do other than help Will out with some design visualizations.
My mile-high perspective, I never played Sims Online, I'm sorry. I wish I did, but my mile-high perspective was that it wasn't long before it all just turned into some creepy sex chat room. Is that what happened to that? What's going on?
At that point, I'd already switched over to work. I guess I'd already started working on SimCity 4.
Okay.
So I was like, yeah, doing that stuff over on that side of the building, and I don't actually know that much about it. I kind of get the sense that that's like, if you look at Second Life, for example, that's just the natural end state of online communities. That's the basin that they all fall into. But
yeah, I think all games, even like The Witness, just turned into some just sex dungeon now. You can't stop it. But let's talk about like the Maxis aesthetic. When do you feel like that came online? And is it an oversimplification just to be like, oh, kind of pastel, peaceful, clean colors?
No, there is a definite Maxis aesthetic, and it kind of came from Will's sensibility. Like it was there in SimCity 2000, and then we developed it and pushed it further with The Sims and SimCity 4 and SimCity 3000 and The Sims 2 and onto Spore, and it's yeah, it was just a shared sensibility among the people that made the games there. Like we were sort of self-consciously making games that weren't kind of your roid-raged Space Marine kind of thing. They were games that were much more software toys than they were traditional games. In fact, I don't know if you know what the Maxis logo looks like, but there's kind of like a crescent moon kind of thing. And that was actually supposed to be a ball to give you the sense of it's a toy. It's like a ball that you bounce, and you can do a million things with a ball. So I think that sensibility comes from just the sensibility of people making what we wanted to be, engaging, charming, delightful toys that had game mechanics driving them, but at heart were toys, were things that you wanted to play with. And there were also games that were all object-based. So, you had libraries of components, and you'd put them down and interact with them and rearrange them in a multitude of different ways. So you think of like buildings in SimCity, there are thousands of buildings, and you have tools for putting them down and picking them up and manipulating them. Or if you think of all the furniture in The Sims, or all the creature parts in Spore. And so there's a certain style that we came up with about kind of clarity and simplicity of these objects that modularly interact with all the other objects. And that drove a bunch of what we did as well.
Do you feel like there's a real sense of pride about being so different in the industry? Do you feel like as a collective unit, you guys were proud of the fact that we aren't Space Marine garbage?
Yeah, we were. We were doing stuff that we could tell our parents about.
Maybe not Sims Online, but other than that, check it out, folks.
Don't go there. Yeah, but yeah, we were doing games that had kind of a wit and sophistication to them. Obviously now the sort of the game space is so huge, and there's people making all sorts of games, from incredibly sophisticated to incredibly crude and so forth. That's great. But at the time, you have to keep in mind, the industry was much, much smaller. And we were we'd staked out a sort of a style and a sensibility. And it was just who we were. I don't even know if we were proud of it or not proud of it. This was just the sort of thing that we did.
Yeah. It's interesting. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but speaking to other people who've worked at Maxis before, they always talk about, Will Wright being heralded as a genius, but it's like, well, it's important to point out, though, there's a real batting average situation. Like Maxis cranked out more games than anybody really remembers, and the ones that hit huge, but there are so many experiments out there. Do you want to talk about that nature a little bit?
Well, that's kind of what I was saying earlier. With the thing with Will is that all his ideas sound terrible. Like initially they sound terrible. You're like a game where you're managing a planet, ecosystems, it's a terrible idea. Even SimCity, he had a hard time getting, this was before my time, he had a hard time getting going because there was no game there. It was just a toy city. But the thing that was remarkable was that you couldn't really tell if they really were terrible until well into the project. And games like SimCity and The Sims turned into sort of cultural touchstones. And then games like Spore, for example, were kind of a swing and a miss, but had elements of that magic to them. They didn't ever quite come together and become sort of coherent, beautiful objects like SimCity and The Sims did, but they had elements of magic to them. And then there's ones, that like SimAt is kind of interesting. You kind of play with it for a bit. SimEarth, kind of interesting. SimCopter, kind of interesting. That's the thing with Will and with Maxis, was, at least for a chunk of them, they were experimental. Trying to find something, trying to strike out into new territory and find some new stuff to do. And you don't always, when you're not just going by the formula, you don't always know what you're going to find. And so sometimes you think, well, this seems terrible, and it is terrible. But sometimes you come over the hill and there's sort of, El Dorado over there.
So I think people familiar with Will Wright will just think that, oh, I'd imagine every time he speaks, it's like one of his GDC talks where your mind's going to be blown. There's so many brilliant theories out there. And I'm curious, what's it like to actually work with the man?
So, I mean, it sort of, I've worked with him for so long that it's hard to answer that question in a single, on some projects, he's really engaged in his prototyping stuff with you and is really on. In other projects, he's kind of like, he shows up and he kind of like swirls around and then he leaves, so it sort of just depends on the project. But that said, he's kind of a crazy genius. Like he's one of the smartest people I've ever worked with, and draws connections between things, finds inspiration for games and things that you wouldn't think are promising ground for inspiration at all.
Yeah. I remember something that always stuck with me is in one of his talks somewhere, he was talking about game design versus physics. I'm sure it was associated with Spore. And he made the comparison saying that physics is taking the infinite possibilities of the universe and boiling it down to a certain code or a certain, set of numbers and equations, so to speak. And then game design is the exact opposite of that.
Right. Yeah. So and we talked about this a bunch, Will and I. Like you could look at physics as essentially a compression algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have this super complicated world out here with, rain falling and planets in orbit and stuff like that, and you want to express that in the most succinct formula possible, right? So it's massive data compression, and then with game design and world creation, you want to create a system that expands to give you a world that you can interact with, and with game design, especially the kind of games we did as well, a big chunk of it is giving the player a system that's rich enough that they can then use their own imaginations with. So it wasn't trying to fill in all the detail. It was to give the player enough detail that they would then bring their own personalities and imaginations to the project and engage with it as a result.
And which game do you think best captured that throughout your time at Maxis?
They all did it in various ways. I was going to say the biggies, The Sims, of course. Like in The Sims, in the first one, we were astounded by how much players would project into the mental lives of the Sims. Like the actual sort of state machines and artificial intelligence that we'd written for the Sims were really simple, and people gave them way more sophistication and read way more into their relationships and their mental states than was actually there. But the same with SimCity. It's the first SimCity was basic cellular automata style simulation, really basic, and people would interpret what was going on in the light of their own experience and project a whole bunch onto that. And then the same with Spore. We saw all these crazy stories that people would make. All these they'd use Spore's creatures and vehicles and architecture editors as sort of jumping off points for the stories that they wanted to tell. So it's they all the successful ones succeeded in different ways at doing that, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, with Spore specifically, I'm curious. It seems like people are bringing it up a lot again in reference to No Man's Sky.
Right.
Are you following No Man's Sky? Do you have any thoughts on the comparison between those two games?
Well, I think this is a. So I think that the engineering and math behind the world creation in No Man's Sky kind of blows the doors off of our procedural world creation. I mean, not to be too blunt about it, but I've been just really impressed with the procedural planet creation and procedural distribution of flora and features on those planets. Those look really, really good. And our stuff was, by contrast, sort of half-baked. But the main thing that Spore brought to the table was sort of the player creativity. Like you had all these tools for creating pretty sophisticated things, sophisticated vehicles, pretty sophisticated creatures, seeing them move around. And so with Spore, ultimately the thing that it gives you was it amplified your creativity. It let you start with something fairly simple and wind up with something that was kind of magical and that you didn't know you could make. And No Man's Sky seems like it's a vastly better sort of universe creation, or created universe, procedurally created universe, but it doesn't really have that player expressivity, baked into it. So there's similar claims for scale and endless experience and stuff like that. So there's definitely overlap, but I think the core things that the two different projects brought. One, in the case of Spore, it was look at the amazing things you'll be able to make. And sorry, you can't actually do all that much with them, but look at the amazing things you get to make. And then in No Man's Sky, it's look at the amazing places you'll get to go and explore.
Yeah.
And there's somewhat different sort of philosophies behind it. I've been really impressed with the art style and the sophistication of the worlds that they've been able to create procedurally.
Yeah, I actually visiting Hello Games over there in England for a cover story a while back. I asked them the exact question about Spore in comparisons, and of course they were unbelievably humble, which is their MO over there, I think. But Sean Murray's like, oh, please, like Spore is a brilliant piece of game design and procedural animation, and I really liked it. And he's like, when the big book on video game procedural animation is written, or procedural generation, he's like, I hope we have like a footnote in the chapter that's devoted to Spore. So that's where they're coming from.
That's way too humble in his case. Like the way that they've solved their problems around like making an infinite variety of creatures and infinite variety of planets is pretty impressive. Like as somebody who's obviously was in the thick of it with Spore, I have a more than casual interest in the way that they did it, and I was impressed with the artistic control that they were able to get. In our case, we wound up having to sacrifice a whole lot of artistic control because we were giving the players the ability to do that, right? And in retrospect, we gave the players so much control that it was difficult for us to sort of make a challenging game experience around it, right? Because we said, hey, here you go. Here's all these wonderful tools for creating things, but it was hard to reason about the things that were created after the fact and make a kind of a tight, structured game experience. It's my hope that that by maintaining more control, No Man's Sky's long-term play experience will be better as a result.
What was it like inside the company after Spore released? Because outside of the afterglow of hype, I played it and really had a great time with it. But I'm just curious, was EA knocking on the door every day being like, sweet Jesus, we need to make our money back on this thing. Let's make Dark Spore, get it out the door.
I mean, we were after Spore, so we did some expansion packs. We made more creature parts and stuff like that. And it made a chunk of money. I didn't pay that much attention at the time because it wasn't my responsibility for how much money they made back, but they did okay with it. You know, it wasn't a financial disaster for them. The Maxis studio then kind of like, well, I guess we'll do something else now, you know, like
moving on.
Moving exactly.
Do you want to talk a little bit about SimCity 2013's development?
Sure.
Maybe just focusing on EA again. Like, what were EA's marching orders with the new SimCity, and how much of that came from Maxis within?
So the initial thing was we wanted to do another SimCity. There'd been a couple other sort of SimCity-ish, SimCity societies that had been done by other studios in the interim, and we thought that the technology had finally gotten to the point where we could make a proper 3D SimCity. Because if you look at SimCity 4, it was isometric. I mean, we wound up building a 3D engine to render all the sprites, but the camera was locked. So even though there was 3D geometry there, you could never move the camera down into it. And so we thought that the technology had finally gotten to the point where you could make reasonable looking architecture and reasonable looking buildings. And so it came out of a sort of desire to revisit SimCity as a world, right? As a place that you could kind of fly around, and there's kind of so there were a bunch of sort of visuals that I wanted to see. You know, I wanted to see the sort of the model railroad landscapes of my childhood, you know, like stuff building in my grandmother's basement, you know, brought to life in a really sophisticated way.
And was a tilt shift look part of that?
Yeah, that was the tilt shift look, and and it's maybe a little hard to describe, but there's sort of an exaggeration and a amplification of a bunch of features in SimCity. Like the buildings were sort of compressed and expanded in different ways, so that like the doors and the windows would be more prominent. So we tried to take everything to make it sort of really interesting. So everything was interesting to look at, you know, and everything was kind of exciting to look at. So we initially, a bunch of us at Maxis said, let's try and put together a sort of a rough prototype and a pitch for how this could work. And after a while, he said, okay, you guys can do that. And the considerations were that they wanted to make it, EA wanted to make it a more of a platform, an ongoing platform that they sort of build and develop on. And so that mandated the kind of the server and online stuff, which in retrospect, I mean, obviously was the fatal flaw in it.
Yeah. Were you personally excited about that stuff, or was it just like, well, I guess we have to put this in here?
Well, so it was stuff we had to do, and then the problem was, how do we make it so that it actually gives the player some value, right? Like if you say, well, this is the way the system, these are constraints the system has to solve for, then how do you solve them in a way that that makes the game more interesting, as opposed to a way that's just a straitjacket. And so that's when we thought, well, there's all kinds of interesting stuff you can do with cities in the context of other cities, and cities in the context of the larger environment around them. like where your water comes from, where your labor force comes from, where do homeless people go? What's the does crime in a neighboring city affect your city? If you want to have a garden city and you have a neighboring city that's generating lots of power, could you shunt the pollution over to that city and keep all the power for yourself? So there are interesting sort of design space possibilities that are opened up by the requirement for it to always be online. But obviously, it would have been nicer if those were optional. If you'd say like, "Hey, yeah, these are all things if you want to play online, you can do," but if you don't.
Is the push from EA for that stuff just so that players are one step closer to microtransactions, or what's the idea there for pushing so much for online?
I think at the time it was sort of, EA just saw this as the future. Like, this is just how things are going to be. Like that you'll have an always online, always connected game world, and let's use SimCity to push into that glorious vision of the future. So microtransaction selling content, absolutely, it was part of it, but it was more to sort of make a sort of a living online world out of the whole thing that would just always be there. The tech got ahead of itself. We didn't have the back end infrastructure to actually pull that off. Obviously, it was the meltdown when we actually had a million people pile in was just appalling, at the time.
Yeah, what is it like to go into the office every day when the outside world is losing its mind trying to play this game?
Yeah. Well, it was grim. I mean, we were pretty happy with the actual game, the game part of the game, the way that it looked, the stuff that you could do. I mean, there was stuff that needed iteration and polishing. The game went out a little earlier than it should have, but nevertheless, like, I thought the game was pretty beautiful. Like, the stuff that I was worried about, like, is the terrain fun to play with? Was it fun to draw roads? Do the buildings tell you what's going on? Can you look at all the little people and imagine the activities in life of the city? Like, there was a lot of magic going on there.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And so the back end of it all sort of collapsing in flaming server rooms was well, it feels a little bit like sort of being somebody on a sinking ship, and you've done a really nice job on your part of it, but like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you've made all these beautiful things, because the rest of the ship is exploding.
And it's just like the tech department is just people just with 1,000-yard stares. They've been up for 3 days. Like, is that what it's like?
There was a bunch of that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
That I didn't, for the most part, personally have to engage that much with that, because it was like, I'm not a back-end server engineer and don't kind of have to deal with allocating all these server resources and figuring out where the bottlenecks are and stuff like that. So at my level, I'm like, what's going on, guys? Like, can we let players in now?
Can people like our game yet?
And so that was pretty hard, as a designer, having built something that was, I thought, pretty wonderful, pretty magical, and then no, you can't play it. No, that's not for you.
Yeah, I really love SimCity 2013. Like, I mean, obviously the size of the cities was an issue, but I mean, for like those 5 or so hours where you're building up to that limit, I thought obviously the art, the music, my God, the music, and just the way that it rolled out the systems to you was so clean and so wonderful.
Yeah. I think a lot of things went right with that project. If the sort of rollout hadn't been so calamitous, then it would have been straightforward enough to build out larger cities, for example. And the eventual vision was that the whole region, the whole vast, 32 kilometer by 32 kilometer region would be one potential city, and you could build anywhere in it. Like the whole thing was going to be there's just a landscape, and you can build a city over here, and then scroll over here and build a city over there, and then connect the two of them together.
And that was the plan post-launch, or that was the plan initially?
That sort of before we launched. My design intent there was to expand the cities until they eventually abutted each other.
Gotcha.
And then you just have a huge connected landscape to build in. But after the launch, it was like, well, maybe not.
I don't think it's gonna be possible. So it's just the tech just couldn't live up to the dreams.
The back ends basically it was the back end server stuff, like the simulation engine with more powerful computers and more memory would have let us scale eventually to larger and larger cities until eventually the whole region could be one vast city, and that was sort of the initial design intent behind it, but that never to be.
Oh man, was that the toughest part of your career, do you think?
I'd say that was pretty much the hardest part of my career. Yeah. I'm sorry if this is a sensitive topic, but was the rise of City Skylines' popularity then the next year, was that a silver lining? Just that this game that
can
was
still
really cool.
Okay.
Keep in mind, like, I don't own SimCity, right?
Right.
SimCity belongs to EA, and so we threw all this stuff out there, put all this stuff out there for people, and the fact that City Skylines was able to take a whole bunch of the ideas and keep them alive, put them into a new product and get them in front of people is, great. I have to admit, I'm looking at some of the data view stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of familiar. Like they took some of it just straight up, but they're welcome to it. As far as I'm concerned, the ideas, you don't own ideas, right? Like you basically make something and you put it out there, and then people pick it up, and if they like it, they do more stuff with it themselves. And I'm all for that.
Did you play a fair amount of City Skylines then?
I played a bunch. I think the gameplay was nice and smooth. The art polish didn't quite do it for me.
Okay.
I'm somebody who's particularly obsessed about like the way things look and the sort of the relationship between the simulation and the visuals.
Yeah.
And the City Skyline stuff didn't quite pull that off for me in the way that I kind of wanted. Yeah. But that said, it's a good game, and I'm happy that they're keeping the torch alight. Is kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah, it's got to be nice. I mean, that game has been really successful, and I'm curious what you think about kind of the other side of the sim genre, which seems like it's free to play iOS stuff. I think SimCity and iOS is doing really well. What do you think about that scene?
I don't actually. I'm old school enough that I'm more of a PC gamer, so I don't actually pay that much attention to the free to play stuff. I kind of like big old elaborate simulation games that I can play on my computer with lots of memory. Yeah. And so I noodle around with The Sims free to play and SimCity free to play, but by and large they're not for me.
Sure.
I'm more of a PC gamer.
So looking back at your time at Maxis as a whole, is there anything you think that the public doesn't appreciate enough about Maxis's role in the industry, or about what made Maxis unique?
I think Maxis I think Maxis is they've got a reputation. People know what they did. They had their own particular style. I wish that more people were making Maxis style simulation sandbox toy box games. Now I wish it was actually a larger part of the industry. It always felt a little separate and boutique-y, from the sort of mainstream industry. And you'd have that sense when you're going to E3 or GDC that the things that we were doing were standing a little bit aside from the sort of the main sort of thrust of the game industry. But I think people liked them. I mean, they were good. They were good games, and they had they got recognized as such. so no, really, I've got no grounds for complaint. Like it was,
Yeah.
we did fun projects and people liked them, and it was a good time.
Yeah, it's really amazing that there hasn't been, and maybe there were around 2000, I just don't remember, but it's amazing that there hasn't been like a City Skylines-esque renaissance for something like The Sims. It seems like the market's right for that.
We've always, at Maxis, we were always expecting somebody to come up with a reasonable Sims competitor, like I mean, there's very few genres where you've only got one game,
Yeah.
that is the genre. But part of it, I think, is that like The Sims is really about kind of domesticity and people's ordinary lives. And I mean, obviously, you turned it up to 11, but it's not about orcs and space marines and explosions and stuff like that so much as it is about kind of domestic triumphs and failures and stuff like that. And I think maybe a lot of game developers just aren't interested in that. So part of it is like people just don't want to do that. They want to make games that are more escapist power fantasies or so. This is just speculation on my part. I don't actually know why there haven't been any sort of like full-on AAA competitors to The Sims or full-on like no offense to City Skylines, but why there haven't been any like 10 million, 20 million, $30 million budgeted competitors to SimCity beats me. I will say that those games, those systems-based games, are hard. That they take a real different mindset than games that are more level-based, where you have a character and you can sort of build a level and then kind of run down the level. And
so when so much talent in the industry is used to that developing mind frame, it's tough to shift out.
It's tough to if you haven't ever done systems-based games before, games that are all about thousands of interlocking parts in a simulation that's driving them all, then and you've mostly made levels and made kind of enemy AI that is mostly concerned with strafing and stuff like that, then it's a different mindset and different skill set. So maybe that's it, but I honestly don't know. Some combination of cultural sensibility and some combination of sort of production expertise that makes it hard.
Sure. Well, hey, do you want to give a heads up for when Atomic Space Command is going to be released?
So we were just out at PAX East showing Atomic Space Command, and we've got we're still alpha, pre-alpha-ish. The game's not feature complete. We're letting people play it. I mean, if they go to atomicspacecommand.net, they can just download it and start playing it even now. But it's alpha software, pre-alpha software, so it's going to crash and it's going to be buggy and not feature complete. And I'd say we're still a couple of months away from having a more robust alpha with all the multiplayer stuff working properly. And then we're shooting for a beta, like a feature complete, and most of the bugs ironed out by the end of the year. So it's still a little ways out, but you can grab the build right now. You can build ships. You can snap in reactors and put motors in and put blasters in and load crew members up, and then go play. And depending upon, and we put out new builds every week or two. And so depending upon which build you get, you can either hop online with your friends or not, depending upon if we've broken it this week or not. We're not charging anything for it. I mean, just basically get it and play it and hop on our forums and give us feedback about what you like and what you don't.
It seems like a peaceful life you got going on.
It's pretty fun, yeah.
Is it stress-free game development these days?
No, because when there's basically just a few of you and you're cranking to put a game out, and you're not making any money until the game actually does come out, it does motivate you to work until midnight. Yeah.
Well, hey, for making money on the other side of things, do you have a plug for where people can look at your paintings, look at your work?
Sure. So people can go to my website, oceanquigley.com, or they can go to I've got a gallery that shows my work, Chloe Gallery. Then just Google Chloe Gallery in San Francisco to see stuff. And if you're in San Francisco, you can see it in person. And then I've got a blog where I stick all kinds of stuff up, both like old stuff from Maxis and paintings and stuff from Atomic Space Command. And that's at oceanquigley.blogspot.com.
Awesome.
That's kind of from back in the day when Blogspot was a thing.
It was huge.
But I've maintained it.
Nice. I've never commissioned artwork, but I'm tempted to get a painting from you and pay you big money for like the SimCopter protagonist in beautiful style, just a giant canvas of that ugly, ugly guy.
That would be really funny.
It'd be your finest work. All right, but hey, Ocean, thank you so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you. It was a pleasure chatting with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for watching or listening to this episode of the Game Informer Show. Be sure to tune in next week, and we'll have a new episode waiting for you. Bye, everybody.